Cults in Western society, the masses, the media, and the menace. My project concerns cult organizations in the United States. I will start by defining what a cult is. Much like our definition of what shamanism is, coming up with a single definition of what a cult is can be contentious, and we must look at several broad definitions to get an idea of what these organizations are. So what is a cult? A cult can be defined in any of the following ways. It can be a spurious pseudo-religious group headed by a powerful leader. It can be considered any group that is religious in nature that rejects traditional Christian beliefs. And it can also be used as a blanket term that encompasses any spiritual or religious group with deviant or idiosyncratic beliefs or practices. In defining what a cult is, it's also important to know what a new religious movement is and how the terms differ from each other. An NRM is simply any recently organized religious or spiritual phenomenon that is outside the realm of traditional movements. All modern cults can be considered new religious movements, but not all new religious movements are cults. We can also define cults by comparing them to other religious organizations using Becker's church sect typology. Groups further to the right on the spectrum are considered to be at equilibrium within society, and those on the left are considered to be more volatile or in protest of the predominant religions or cultures that surround them. For the sake of simplicity, we can compare and contrast cults with churches and sects. Churches are structured entities that have stood the test of time and are established institutions. Cults, on the other hand, are mostly volatile and short-lived organizations. Churches are also characterized by their large followings, while cults have a much smaller and more exclusive following. Lastly, churches reflect societal values, while cults tend to stand in opposition to them. Cults and sects have more in common, though. In contrast to churches, they both tend to be smaller, less organized, typically shorter-lived, more exclusive in their membership, and more radical in their beliefs. There are important distinctions between the two, though. Sects are groups that splinter off from churches, and cults tend to form around individuals. Sects are more organized, less volatile, more established, and larger than cults, but less so than churches. As time goes on, cults can develop into sects, and sects can develop into churches. This can occur with time, tighter organization, growth in the number of followers, and increased acceptance within society. Conversely, new cults can form as a result of dissatisfaction with pre-established religions, and new sects can form from divisions within churches. Another way to view this phenomenon is through a classification system devised by Stark and Bainbridge. Under their system, there are three kinds of cults. The first is an audience cult. This kind of cult does not meet in person and instead interacts through print, radio, and television. The second kind of cult is a client cult. Under this model, participants develop a relationship with their leaders similar to that of patients and their therapists. The third is a cult movement. This is the most organized of the three and the one that resembles a religious institution the most. The development of Scientology is an example of all three of these. It started off as a book by L. Ron Hubbard, it developed into a client cult known as Dianetics, and then it became a cult movement when it was established as the Church of Scientology. With an idea of what cults are now, we can briefly dive into the history. Some scholars argue that the earliest well-known cult-like organization in America was the Mormons. Labeling them a cult is debatable, though. They could be considered sect-like or church-like in Utah, but anywhere else in the U.S. they are much smaller in aggregation and much more cult-like. Some scholars define the KKK and the Jehovah's Witnesses as cults as well, but these classifications are also debated. In the mid to late 20th century, there's more of a consensus on organizations that are cults as some rise to national renown. I include only a few well-known ones here for the sake of brevity. It's important to note that the amount of cults in the U.S. has increased exponentially since the 1970s, with estimates ranging between about 700 to about 5,000 active groups in the 1990s. So what makes a cult a cult? The deviant set of beliefs, for one. Every cult has a unique belief system and ritual practice, but there are commonalities between groups. In some, the leader might be regarded as a god, and in others, the leader might merely be seen as a messenger for God. Some might be based around the coming apocalypse, and others might believe in extraterrestrial intervention. There's a wide variety of beliefs. There are a few other common characteristics of note that can be applied, although they are not universally applicable to every cult. The first is the presence of a dogmatic and influential leader. Through promises of alternate forms of salvation, psychological manipulation, and powerful charisma, the leaders are able to exercise strict control over their followers. In most cases, cults lose their power and following when their leader either dies, is imprisoned, or is discredited in some way. Scientology and Mormonism are notable exceptions to this rule, as both were able to carry on after the death of their leaders. Other organizations like Manson's family splintered out when Manson was arrested after the highly publicized murders he orchestrated. The followers are another important characteristic of cults. Followers are often led to join through false means or pretenses and are kept under rigid physical and psychological control. The most likely people to join cults are those who are, on average, younger, better educated than the general public, and come from middle to upper middle class households. Once they join, the followers are kept in line through methods similar to those used by totalitarian governments. This may include brainwashing, peer pressure, using their anxieties and fears against them, and threatening family members. Also through manipulation of an individual's body, sleep schedule, diet, finances, and/or social interactions. These kinds of practices and the existence of cults have prompted some anti-cult movements. The American Family Foundation is an example of such a group that is composed of former members and their families that aims to provide information, support, and counseling for people involved with cults. Groups such as the AFF and the former cult individuals are instrumental in speaking out against the cult epidemic. More established religious organizations and the American government have been less willing to respond to the issue of cults. Some religious leaders have spoken out against the dangerous nature of cults, but others have been hesitant because they believe it may lead to censure of the current protections granted to established religions granted by the First Amendment. The U.S. government is hesitant to speak out or respond to the cult epidemic for similar legal reasons regarding the First Amendment. Because of the separation of church and state put forth by the Constitution, the government has little power to govern or survey over cult activity. Only in cases where there is an apparent risk to human lives has preventative government action been undertaken. On a final note, the media responses to cult activity have been anything but muted. Compared to the reporting done on traditional religions, cults tend to have negative characterizations applied to them by news outlets, and they are often portrayed as dangerous entities in the mediums of television, film, and literature.